Millionaire falls into a coma, and what a stranger did to his son surprised everyone. The soft aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the gentle breeze that entered through the large glass window in the kitchen. Golden rays of sunlight streamed through sheer curtains, casting warm patterns on the white marble floor. Ethan Williams' house looked like a living painting, where every detail exuded elegance and harmony. But what truly made the scene special wasn't the luxury, it was the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the living room. Jacob, his 7-year-old son, sat on the floor surrounded by colored pencils and scattered sheets of paper. His head tilted slightly to the side, his face filled with deep concentration. The tip of his tongue peeked out from the corner of his mouth as he focused on his latest art project. His little hands moved with purpose as he filled in the colors of his masterpiece. "Dad, look. It's you," Jacob said, holding up the paper with pride. Ethan's smile appeared instantly. He stopped adjusting the cuffs of his white shirt and approached, kneeling next to his son. His eyes carefully scanned the drawing. It was a superhero with a red cape and a large E on his chest. "An E for Ethan or for extraordinary?" he asked with playful curiosity. Jacob burst into a contagious giggle. "Both. You're my superhero, Dad," he declared with absolute conviction. Ethan ran a hand through Jacob's messy hair and gave him a gentle pat on the head. "If I'm a superhero, then you're my special sidekick. And every hero needs a sidekick to remind them of the important missions, right?" he said, pointing to the wall clock. "And right now, our mission is to not be late for school." Jacob's eyes widened, and he jumped to his feet, rushing to gather his colored pencils in a hurry. "Wait, Dad. I need to save my drawings. They're important." Ethan chuckled softly as he grabbed his son's blue backpack and opened it to store the precious artwork with care. "Here you go, little artist. Now, let's go. Backpack on, shoes on, and," he paused dramatically, pointing toward the door. "Off to school." Jacob dashed around the house, putting on his sneakers as fast as he could, while Ethan grabbed the car keys from the countertop. Every moment of that morning felt so ordinary, yet there was a silent beauty in its simplicity. Minutes later, Ethan's sleek black SUV moved smoothly through the sunlit streets. The sound of an upbeat song played on the radio, and Jacob, with the boundless energy of a child, sang along, making up words for the parts he didn't know. "When the song goes, oh yeah, you have to do this, Dad," Jacob said, waving his arms around like a conductor. "Like this?" Ethan tilted his head and wiggled his shoulders awkwardly, just to hear his son burst into loud, joyful laughter. "No. That's all wrong." Jacob laughed so hard he had to hold his stomach. "You dance like a broken robot, Dad." "A broken robot?" Ethan gasped in mock offense. "That's no way to talk to a superhero, Mr. Jacob Williams." Their laughter filled the car, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt something rare, peace. The weight of meetings, contracts, and responsibilities seemed to vanish in the face of his son's unfiltered joy. But the playfulness was soon interrupted by a serious question. "Dad, are you going to pick me up today?" Jacob asked, his voice filled with quiet hope. Ethan glanced at him through the rearview mirror and saw those wide, expectant eyes watching him closely. "Of course I will, champ. I'm leaving work early today, and after school, we're heading straight to the park. We can hit the swings, the slide, and if you behave at school, there might even be some ice cream in it for you." "Chocolate ice cream?" Jacob's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Chocolate ice cream," Ethan confirmed, raising his right hand like he was taking a solemn oath. "Superheroes promise." Jacob grinned and leaned forward to give him their special, superhero handshake, a secret series of hand movements they'd invented together. It was their personal ritual, a symbol of trust that only the two of them understood. This small gesture sealed the biggest promises between father and son. When they arrived at school, Ethan pulled the car up to the curb and looked at Jacob. The boy had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was about to jump out, but he stopped for a moment. "Don't forget, okay, Dad? I'll be waiting for you," Jacob said, his voice carrying the seriousness only a child could have. Ethan nodded, feeling a small, inexplicable tightness in his chest. "I never forget a promise, champ." Satisfied, Jacob smiled, waved, and ran off toward the school gate. He didn't look back, too focused on his friends waiting for him at the entrance. Ethan stayed for a few seconds longer, watching his son disappear into the crowd of children. A part of him had expected Jacob to turn around for one last glance, but it didn't happen. With a deep breath, he started the engine and slowly pulled away. The sun, which had been soft and golden in the early morning, now shone brighter and hotter, casting sharp beams on the concrete streets and tall office buildings ahead. At the next traffic light, Ethan glanced at his phone. Notifications blinked on the screen, text messages, reminders for meetings, and one email marked urgent with the name of an important client in bold letters. He bit his bottom lip, thinking for a moment. Just a quick look, he told himself. He unlocked the phone and opened the email, his eyes darting over the lines of text. It was about a major business merger. A crucial deal. He scanned the information quickly, his eyes moving back and forth between the screen and the road. His gaze shifted from the road to the phone and back to the road again. His mind told him he was in control. But control, as it always is, was an illusion. Up ahead, a traffic light turned from green to yellow. On the other side of the intersection, a large construction truck barreled forward, carrying a heavy load of materials. Ethan didn't see the light change. He didn't see the truck coming. His eyes were still on the screen. A horn blared loudly. A scream echoed, but it wasn't clear where it came from. In that single, irreversible moment, everything shattered. The world spun out of control. The sound of crumpling metal, the piercing crack of glass, and the deafening impact surrounded him. Time seemed to fold in on itself. The email remained unfinished. Promises, unfulfilled. And then, nothing but silence. The superhero had fallen. A sharp smell of burnt rubber and gasoline filled the air. The soft hum of the morning had been replaced by chaos. Shattered glass glittered on the asphalt like tiny fragments of broken stars. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood of Ethan's SUV, curling into the air in ghostly tendrils. Cars slowed to a stop, drivers craning their necks to see what had happened. Emily Carter gripped the strap of her shoulder bag tightly as she stepped out of her small blue sedan, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Her eyes darted toward the wreckage in front of her, locking onto the sight of the black SUV smashed into the side of a large construction truck. The front of the SUV was crushed like an accordion. Her breath caught in her throat. Her instincts kicked in. She dropped her bag on the sidewalk and rushed toward the car. "Sir! Can you hear me?" she called, her voice sharp and commanding like she'd done this 100 times before. Emily wasn't just anyone. She was a nurse. And while she was technically off duty that day, her training never truly stopped. Her eyes moved quickly, assessing the scene. Her fingers pressed against the cold glass of the driver's side window, peering inside. The man was slumped over the steering wheel, his head tilted to the side. Blood trickled down his forehead, creating a thin, bright red line across his face. His chest rose and fell slowly, but it was shallow. Too shallow. Stay with me," she muttered, more to herself than to him. Her hands trembled as she tugged at the handle of the driver's side door, but it wouldn't budge. It was jammed. Her mind raced. She glanced around and spotted a man in a gray hoodie filming the scene with his phone. Her eyes narrowed with frustration. "Stop recording and help me," she shouted at him, her voice slicing through the growing crowd. The man hesitated, but after a second, he shoved his phone into his pocket and jogged toward her. "Grab that side. We need to get this door open." she ordered, her voice brooking no argument. The man nodded, and together they pulled with all their strength. The metal groaned but didn't give. Emily's jaw tightened. Her fingers ached from the strain, but she didn't stop. Not until she heard it, a loud pop as the frame shifted just enough for them to pry the door open. Yes. Yes. She gasped, her hands immediately moving toward Ethan. His head lolled to the side, his face pale. She tapped his cheek with quick, firm pats. "Sir, can you hear me? Open your eyes. Look at me." Her tone was urgent but controlled. He didn't respond. His breathing remained shallow, his chest barely rising. Her fingers pressed against his neck, searching for a pulse. There it was. Weak, but steady. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. She needed to act fast. Her nurse's instincts took over. She tilted his head back slightly to keep his airway clear. She checked his pupils. One was sluggish, the other more reactive. Possible concussion. Blood was still seeping from the cut on his forehead. Her eyes moved to his chest. The rise and fall were too slow. Her gut told her there might be internal bleeding. Her hands hovered for a moment, torn between doing more and knowing she needed help. "I need an ambulance," she shouted at the crowd behind her. "Somebody call 911. "It's already on the way," yelled a voice from the crowd. Emily's eyes flicked back to Ethan. She leaned in closer, her face just inches from his. "Listen to me. You're not alone, okay? Help is coming. Just hold on. Stay with me." Her voice was softer now, almost gentle. "Your son needs you. Don't you dare give up." Her words hung in the air, invisible but powerful. Suddenly, she felt movement. Ethan's fingers twitched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Emily felt it. She looked down and saw his hand shift slightly, his fingers curling toward hers like he was reaching out for something. Without hesitation, she grabbed his hand and held it tightly. That's it. You're still here. I've got you," she said, her eyes locked on his face. "I'm not going anywhere." The distant sound of sirens grew louder. Flashes of red and blue light reflected off the nearby windows. Help was almost there. Emily leaned forward again, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her breath steady and measured. "You're going to be okay. Just hang on, okay? Your son is waiting for you. Remember that. He's waiting for you." The sirens were deafening now. Paramedics jumped out of the ambulance with precision and urgency. They moved toward her with a stretcher and medical equipment in hand. "Nurse?" one of the paramedics asked, noticing how Emily had already assessed Ethan's condition. "Internal bleeding possible. Head injury. Pupil delay on the right side. Breathing shallow. Pulse is weak but steady," she rattled off, never letting go of Ethan's hand. "We've got it from here," the paramedic said, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. Emily hesitated for a second before releasing Ethan's hand. She took a step back, eyes still fixed on him as the paramedics began their work. They placed an oxygen mask over his face, strapped him to a backboard, and prepared to lift him onto the stretcher. Her heart pounded as she watched. Her fingers tingled with the phantom feeling of Ethan's hand still in hers. She knew she should leave. Her part was done. But something deep inside her wouldn't let her walk away. Her gaze shifted to the phone sticking out of Ethan's jacket pocket. It buzzed once, then again. She reached for it, almost without thinking. The name Jacob's School flashed across the screen. Her breath caught in her chest. "Miss, you okay?" a paramedic asked. She blinked, her mind still on that name. "Jacob. That's his son," she murmured, almost to herself. She glanced at Ethan, then back to the paramedic. "Can I go with him? He might need someone when he wakes up." The paramedic gave her a quick glance but didn't argue. "Get in." Emily climbed into the ambulance, sitting next to Ethan, her eyes focused on him the entire ride. Her fingers hovered over his phone. The school was calling again. Her heart ached. She didn't know this man, not really, but she knew this much: somewhere, a little boy was waiting for his father. She stared at the phone as it buzzed in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Answer it, she thought. But would they believe her? What would she even say? The weight of the decision pressed down on her as the ambulance rushed forward, sirens wailing. Ethan's face was pale but calm now under the mask. Her fingers curled tightly around the phone. She took a deep breath and pressed answer. "Hello. This is Jacob's school. We're calling because his father hasn't arrived to pick him up." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Hi, this is Emily. I'm with his father right now. He's had an accident. But don't worry, I'll pick Jacob up. I'll be there." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you family?" the voice asked cautiously. Emily's lips parted, but she didn't know how to answer. Her gaze shifted to Ethan's face, peaceful despite the chaos around him. "Yes," she said softly, surprising even herself. "I'm family." The words hung in the air. They felt strange, foreign. But she didn't take them back. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, she glanced down at Ethan one more time. She didn't know what force had pulled her into his life, but she could feel it now, strong and unshakable. Somehow, in that moment, she knew. She was part of this story now. There was no turning back. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly as the ambulance doors swung open. The harsh glow contrasted with the dimming afternoon sky outside. The paramedics moved with swift precision, guiding the stretcher carrying Ethan out of the vehicle. Emily followed close behind, her heart pounding harder with every step. Male, mid-30s, possible internal bleeding, head trauma, shallow breathing, one paramedic reported to the incoming medical team. Pupils uneven. Pulse weak but steady. The words echoed in Emily's mind, but her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. His face was pale, his eyes still closed beneath the oxygen mask. She could still feel the weight of his hand in hers, even though she wasn't holding it anymore. As the emergency team wheeled him through the automatic sliding doors, Emily hesitated at the entrance. She wasn't family. She had no reason to follow. But something inside her wouldn't let her walk away. Her gaze dropped to the phone in her hand. Jacob's name was still fresh in her mind. That little boy was waiting for his father. He didn't know yet. He didn't know his world had just shifted. Emily took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Ma'am, are you with the patient?" a nurse asked, her eyes flicking between Emily and the stretcher. There was a pause. Emily knew she could say no. She could walk away. But something about the way Ethan's hand had moved, the warmth of it as he reached for hers, lingered in her heart. "Yes," she said, her voice more certain than she expected. "I'm with him." The nurse nodded, signaling for Emily to follow. "We need to get him stabilized. Stay here and I'll update you as soon as I can." "What's your relationship to the patient?" the nurse asked, tapping something into a tablet. Emily hesitated again. Words bounced around in her head: stranger, bystander, nurse off duty. But none of them felt right. Her eyes flickered back to Ethan, now being rushed into a treatment room. Her grip on the phone tightened. I'm his wife," she blurted out. The word surprised her. Her eyes widened, and her heart raced as she realized what she had just said. But the nurse didn't even blink. "Got it. Wife. We'll update you soon," the nurse replied, typing it into the system before walking away. Emily blinked rapidly, her heart pounding harder than it had during the rescue. Why did I say that? She thought, rubbing her hands together. Her mind scrambled for logic, but deep down, she knew. If she had said anything else, they might have made her leave. She couldn't explain why, but the idea of leaving Ethan now didn't sit right with her. Her fingers hovered over his phone again. Another notification popped up, missed call from Jacob's school. Her throat tightened as she stared at it. A deep breath. Another decision she didn't have time to question. She pressed call back. Hello, this is Riverview Elementary. How can I help you? Hi, it's Emily, she said, her voice soft but steady. I'm calling about Jacob Williams. I got a message saying he needs to be picked up. Oh, thank you for calling back, the receptionist said with a hint of relief. We've been trying to reach his father, but we didn't get an answer. Are you able to pick him up? Emily glanced toward the hallway where Ethan had been taken. The emergency doors were closed now, blocking her view. The air around her felt heavy. Yes, she replied firmly. I'll be there soon. Please tell him I'm coming. Will do. Thank you, Mrs. Williams. Mrs. Williams. Her heart skipped at the sound of it, but she didn't correct the receptionist. She hung up and leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the accident, Ethan, Jacob, the choice she'd made. But there was no turning back now. Ma'am. A voice startled her. It was the nurse from before. He's stable for now, but he's still unconscious. We're running tests to check for internal bleeding. You can wait in the family room if you'd like. Emily nodded. Thank you, she said quietly. Her feet moved automatically toward the family waiting area. It smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. The chairs were stiff, the kind designed to make you uncomfortable enough to leave. But Emily didn't sit. Her mind was already focused on her next task. Jacob. She had promised to pick him up. Her eyes shifted to the hallway where Ethan lay behind closed doors. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with doubt. But then she remembered the words she had spoken to him in the ambulance. I'm not going anywhere, she had said. Her fingers hovered over his phone screen once more. This time, she found a contact labeled Mrs. Porter, nanny. Her eyes narrowed. She tapped on it. The phone rang twice before a soft, older voice answered. Hello. Hi, Mrs. Porter. My name is Emily. I'm a family friend of Ethan's. There's been an accident. He's at the hospital, and I'm on my way to pick up Jacob from school. I just wanted you to know. There was a pause on the other end. Oh, dear Lord. Is he all right? Mrs. Porter's voice trembled with concern. He's stable, but they're still running tests. I'll stay with Jacob tonight if it's all right with you, Emily said, her tone as steady as possible. Of course, of course. Just keep me updated, dear. Jacob's a sensitive boy. He's going to be worried sick if he finds out. Emily nodded to herself. I will. Thank you, Mrs. Porter. She ended the call, exhaled deeply, and glanced at the clock on the wall. She had 20 minutes to get to the school. Her fingers twitched as she considered going back to check on Ethan, but she knew she couldn't be in two places at once. Her eyes softened with determination. I've got this, she whispered to herself. With that, she strode out of the hospital, her footsteps quick and purposeful. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the city. Traffic was heavier now, but Emily weaved through it, her knuckles tight on the steering wheel. She glanced at the rearview mirror and saw her own reflection, tense, focused, but not afraid. When she arrived at Riverview Elementary, children were already gathering at the front gate. Parents and guardians stood in small clusters, chatting as they waited. Emily parked on the curb, stepped out, and scanned the crowd. It didn't take long to spot Jacob. He was sitting on a bench, his backpack on his lap, swinging his legs back and forth. His eyes darted between each adult that approached, searching for one face. Her heart ached at the sight. She approached him slowly, trying not to overwhelm him. "Jacob?" she called softly. He turned his head, eyes wide with confusion. "Who are you?" he asked, pulling his backpack closer. Emily crouched down so she was at his level, her eyes kind but steady. "I'm a friend of your dad's," she said gently. "Your dad had a little accident, so I came to pick you up. He's going to be okay. I promise." Jacob didn't move at first. His eyes searched hers, looking for cracks, for anything that didn't feel right. "Is he hurt?" he asked, his voice small. Emily's heart squeezed, but she nodded slowly. "He's a little hurt, but he's in the best hands. The doctors are helping him right now." Jacob stared at her for a moment longer, then did something that surprised them both. He stood up and reached for her hand. "Okay," he said quietly. "Can we get ice cream on the way?" Emily's eyes softened as she held his small hand. "Chocolate?" she asked with a small smile. Jacob nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Dad promised." Emily swallowed the tight feeling in her throat. "Then a promise is a promise, champ." She led him to the car, her heart heavier than before, but her resolve stronger. She didn't know how or why she had been pulled into this family story. But now, she was in it. And she wasn't going anywhere. The low hum of the car engine filled the silence between them. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. Jacob sat quietly in the back seat, his face pressed against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. Every few seconds, he would draw little shapes with his finger, circles, squiggles, the occasional smiley face. But he didn't say a word. Her heart ached. Children were supposed to be loud, full of questions, full of energy. This silence felt wrong. "You okay back there, champ?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Jacob shrugged, still tracing shapes on the fogged window. "I guess," he muttered. Emily gripped the steering wheel tighter. She knew he was scared, even if he didn't say it. "You know, I was thinking," she said, glancing at him in the mirror. "We could still stop for that ice cream. Chocolate, right? Your dad said it was your favorite." Jacob's hand paused on the glass, and he looked at her reflection in the mirror. His eyes, round and full of doubt, met hers. "Can we?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course we can," she replied, smiling softly. "A promise is a promise, right?" This time, she saw it, the smallest flicker of hope in his eyes. They pulled into the parking lot of a small ice cream parlor with bright red umbrellas and colorful signs advertising all the classic flavors. Emily turned off the engine and glanced at Jacob. "You coming?" He hesitated for a second, his gaze shifting to the other families sitting at the tables outside. Kids laughing, parents talking, everyone so normal. His fingers gripped the straps of his backpack, holding it tightly against his chest. "What if my dad wakes up and he's scared 'cause I'm not there?" Jacob asked, his eyes fixed on his shoes. Emily leaned over the console, turning to face him fully. Her voice softened. "Your dad is safe right now. He's resting so his body can get strong again. The doctors are with him, and they're taking care of him, just like he takes care of you." She tilted her head, waiting until his eyes finally lifted to meet hers. "And if he wakes up and asks where you are, I'll tell him you were being brave. I'll tell him you were out getting ice cream." Jacob blinked a few times, his eyes glassy with the start of tears. He rubbed them quickly with the sleeve of his hoodie and nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. Emily smiled and reached for the door handle. "Let's go, partner." chocolate's waiting for us." Inside the shop, the sweet smell of vanilla and sugar filled the air. The bright display case showcased rows of colorful ice cream tubs, each more vibrant than the last. Emily crouched next to Jacob as he stared at the options. "So, chocolate, huh?" she teased, nudging him gently. He nodded but didn't say anything. His eyes lingered on the colorful sprinkles in the topping section. "Sprinkles too?" she asked, noticing his gaze. Jacob hesitated but finally nodded. "Sprinkles too," he said softly. She ordered a double scoop of chocolate with rainbow sprinkles, watching as his eyes followed every movement of the ice cream scooper. When the cone was finally in his hands, he stared at it like it was something precious. Slowly, he took a small lick. "Good?" she asked, tilting her head. Jacob nodded again, licking the edge carefully to catch a drip before it fell. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice still quiet but more certain this time. "It's good." They sat at one of the small round tables outside. The sun had started to dip lower, casting golden light over the sidewalk. Emily watched as Jacob ate his ice cream, each slow lick more deliberate than the last. She didn't rush him. She didn't tell him to hurry up like most adults would. She just let him be. For a while, neither of them spoke. But eventually, Jacob broke the silence. "My mom used to get me ice cream too," he said, his voice distant, like he wasn't talking to Emily but to himself. "But she never let me have sprinkles. She said it was too messy." Emily blinked, caught off guard. She stayed quiet, letting him say what he needed to say. "She died," Jacob continued, eyes on his ice cream. 2 years ago. Dad said she went to sleep and didn't wake up. I waited for her to wake up, but she didn't." He stopped licking his ice cream and glanced at Emily, his small eyebrows drawn together. "My dad's not gonna die, right?" Her breath caught in her chest. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. Her eyes met his, steady and strong, even if her heart was breaking. "Your dad is really strong, Jacob. And right now, he's fighting to get better. The doctors are helping him, and I'm here too." She reached across the table, her fingers open, giving him the choice. "You're not alone in this." Jacob stared at her hand for a moment, then slowly set down his ice cream and reached for her. His small fingers wrapped around hers, gripping tightly like he was holding on for dear life. "I don't want him to be alone either," Jacob whispered. Emily felt her throat tighten, but she didn't let it show. She squeezed his hand. "He's not, Jacob. I promise you, he's not." They sat like that for a while, the warm glow of the sun wrapping around them like a blanket. Jacob finished his ice cream, wiping the sticky chocolate off his face with his sleeve. Emily didn't even bother to stop him. Some messes, she figured, weren't worth cleaning up right away. As they got back in the car, Emily glanced at the rearview mirror again. Jacob sat straighter now, his backpack still on his lap but his grip on it was looser. "Where are we going now?" he asked, glancing at her. "My house," she replied. "Just for a little while. We'll eat dinner, watch a movie, and I'll check on your dad to see if there's any news." "What movie?" he asked, his voice more curious now. Emily thought for a moment, smiling softly. "Your choice, partner. Superheroes, maybe?" Jacob's eyes lit up for the first time that day. "Yeah. Can we watch The Guardians? It's got lasers and robots and this really cool fight scene at the end," he said, the excitement spilling out of him all at once. "Sounds like a plan, champ," Emily replied, relief washing over her. The ride back was different this time. Jacob talked. Not a lot, but more than before. He told her about his favorite parts of the Guardians movie, how the hero had to protect his little brother, and how they defeated the big villain in the end. She listened to every word. When they arrived at her house, Jacob followed her inside, his eyes darting around like he was stepping into a new world. Her house was small but cozy, with soft beige walls and framed pictures of her friends and family. "It's nice," Jacob said, walking slowly toward the couch. "Thanks. It's not as big as your house, but I like it," Emily replied as she took off her jacket and hung it on a hook. Jacob sat on the couch, his backpack still on his lap. "You can take that off, you know," Emily said, smiling as she sat next to him. He hesitated, then slowly took off his backpack and set it on the floor. He glanced around, his eyes landing on the television. "Can we watch it now? The Guardians?" he asked, looking at her with wide eyes. "We can do that," she said, grabbing the remote. "But dinner comes first. Superheroes need their energy, after all." Jacob grinned, a small but real smile, the kind that stays with you long after it's gone. For the first time that day, Emily felt like she could breathe. It wasn't perfect. None of it was. But for now, it was enough. She glanced at the phone on the kitchen counter. No missed calls. No updates. Her eyes moved to Jacob, his little frame now sitting comfortably on the couch, his eyes locked on the TV. "He's going to be okay," she whispered to herself. Her hands gripped the counter behind her as she breathed in deep, her eyes sharp with determination. "He has to be." The distant sound of clinking silverware echoed from the kitchen as Emily rinsed off 2 plates and set them on the drying rack. The warm glow of the overhead light cast a soft yellow hue over the small kitchen, making it feel cozier than it really was. She glanced toward the living room, where Jacob was curled up on the couch, eyes glued to the TV as the Guardians played on the screen. His head bobbed slightly to the rhythm of the action scenes, his fingers tapping the edge of the blanket she'd draped over him. He looked calm. Finally. Emily wiped her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter, letting out a deep breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The weight of the day pressed against her shoulders. Every decision, every glance at Ethan's phone, every call she'd made, it all felt like a thread she was pulling tighter and tighter. Her eyes flicked to the phone on the countertop. Still no missed calls. No updates. Her fingers itched to call the hospital, but she didn't want to disturb the nurses. "They'll call if there's news," she told herself. The faint creak of the front door made her turn sharply. Her heart jumped to her throat. She wiped her hands once more, her eyes narrowing. Then she heard it, the jingle of keys being dropped on the side table. Heavy footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Her eyes narrowed. "Ryan," she muttered, bracing herself. He appeared in the hallway moments later, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the faint smell of cheap beer. His plaid shirt was wrinkled, his jeans loose around his waist like he'd lost weight recently. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Emily first, then on Jacob curled up on the couch. "What the hell is this?" Ryan asked, his brow furrowing as he gestured toward Jacob. Emily took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "His name is Jacob. He's staying here for a while," she said plainly, folding her arms across her chest. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his confusion quickly turning into irritation. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Since when did we turn this place into a daycare?" he asked, his tone sharp and condescending. Emily stepped forward, her stance firm, unshaken. "He's just a kid, Ryan. His father's in the hospital. I'm helping him. That's it." Ryan let out a dry laugh, the kind that wasn't really a laugh at all. He tilted his head, looking at her like she'd just told him the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. "Since when is that your problem? Huh? Since when do you take in random kids like some kind of hero?" His words stung, but Emily didn't flinch. "I'm doing what's right, Ryan. You should try it sometime," she shot back, her voice sharp as glass. His smile vanished in an instant. His jaw clenched, his eyes hardening as he took a step closer. Don't get smart with me, Emily. This is our house. Our life. You don't just bring people in here without asking me. Emily didn't back down. Not this time. This hasn't been our house for a long time, Ryan, she said, her voice steady but fierce. And if you're upset about someone bringing strangers in, maybe you should think about all the people you've brought into my life. Her words hit him harder than a slap. His eyes darted to the side, his lips pressing into a tight line. He knew exactly what she meant, but he wasn't about to admit it. Don't do that, he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Don't act like you're better than me. Emily's chest rose and fell slowly. She could feel the weight of every argument they'd ever had hanging in the air. The same old cycle. The same old script. She'd played her part too many times before, but not today. Her eyes flicked toward the living room, where Jacob had turned his head, his small face peeking out from behind the couch. His wide, worried eyes darted between Emily and Ryan. That was it. That was the moment she knew. Her voice was calm but firm. I'm done, Ryan. I'm done with the yelling, the guilt, the games. I'm done with you. Ryan blinked, tilting his head slightly as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Then his eyes narrowed into slits. You think you're so strong now, huh? Just 'cause you've got some little kid watching you? You think I'm scared of you, Emily? He took another step forward, but she didn't move. She didn't even blink. No, Ryan, I don't think you're scared of me, she said quietly. Her eyes didn't waver. Her words were steady, measured, and sharp as steel. I think you're scared of being alone. Silence. Thick and suffocating. Ryan's eyes darted to Jacob again, then back to Emily. His hands twitched at his sides like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to throw something, but he didn't. Instead, he huffed out a bitter breath and ran a hand down his face. You think you're gonna do better without me, huh? He muttered, shaking his head. Fine. You wanna play the big hero? Be the big hero. See how far it gets you. He turned on his heel, snatching his keys off the table. The jingle echoed through the quiet house. I'll be back for my stuff, he called over his shoulder as he opened the door. Don't bother, Emily said, loud enough for him to hear. I'll have it packed for you. He paused for a moment, his back to her, like he was waiting for her to take it back. But she didn't. She stood there, arms folded, unshaken. When he realized she wasn't going to budge, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, rattling the picture frames on the wall. Silence followed. Real silence. Emily let out a slow breath and leaned against the wall, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Her eyes closed for just a second, letting herself feel the weight of it. Not grief. Not regret. Just wait. She stayed like that for a moment, grounding herself, feeling her own strength. A small voice broke the silence. Is he gone? Her eyes snapped open. She turned her head to see Jacob, still peeking from behind the couch. He didn't look scared anymore. Just curious. Emily's heart softened. Yeah, buddy. He's gone, she said softly, walking toward him. She crouched down so they were at eye level. Is he coming back? Jacob asked, tilting his head. Emily smiled, a small, tired smile, but a smile nonetheless. Nope. He's not coming back, she said firmly. Jacob blinked, his face thoughtful for a second. Then, to her surprise, he smiled too. Good, he said simply, and turned back to the TV. Emily let out a small laugh, a real one this time. She sat next to him on the couch, leaning back and letting herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She glanced at it, half expecting Ryan to send a nasty message. But it wasn't him. It was the hospital. Her heart skipped. She shot up from the couch, hurrying over to answer it. "Hello? Mrs. Williams? This is Nurse Kelsey from St. John's Hospital. We're calling to let you know Ethan is out of surgery." Emily closed her eyes, relief washing over her. Her hand gripped the countertop. "Is he okay?" "He's stable, but he's still unconscious. No signs of brain damage, but he's being monitored closely." Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes flicking to Jacob, still watching TV with his legs swinging off the couch. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you so much." She ended the call and set the phone down, feeling a weight lift from her chest. She glanced at Jacob again, and for the first time that day, she felt certain about something. She wasn't just helping out. She was staying. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt empty. It was the kind of quiet that hummed with the weight of something new. The TV was still playing softly in the background, but the action scenes of the Guardians had been replaced by the soft credits music. Jacob had fallen asleep on the couch, his small body curled up like a cat beneath the blanket Emily had given him. His face was peaceful, cheeks slightly flushed from the warmth of the house. Emily stood nearby, watching him in silence. Her arms were crossed, and her eyes softened with something she hadn't expected to feel: protectiveness. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, dimly lit after the last call from the hospital. No new updates. Ethan was stable, but still unconscious. Stable is good, she reminded herself. Stable means he's still here. She glanced at Jacob again, and for the first time, the weight of it all really settled on her. This boy wasn't her responsibility. She didn't owe him anything. She could have left him at school. She could have called a social worker, let someone else deal with it. But she hadn't. And now, watching him sleep, she knew why. This wasn't about obligation. This was about choice. She walked over to the couch, crouching down beside him. His little fingers were still gripping the edge of the blanket like he was holding on to it for safety. She reached out, gently brushing the hair away from his forehead. "You've had a big day, huh, champ?" She whispered softly, knowing he wouldn't hear her. Her eyes lingered on his face for a moment longer before she stood up. Her legs felt heavier than they should have. Her body knew what her mind hadn't fully admitted yet: she was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that sits deep in your bones. Emily glanced toward the hallway, her eyes landing on the door to the guest room. Her mind weighed the options. He could sleep on the couch, but he deserves better than that. With a quiet sigh, she moved to the guest room, flicking on the light. The soft glow revealed a simple, clean space, a neatly made bed with white sheets, a small nightstand with a lamp, and a framed picture of Emily with her sister at the beach. She hadn't had a guest stay here in months, but tonight, it wasn't just a guest. Tonight, it was Jacob. She pulled back the blankets, smoothing them down like her mother used to do when she was little. Her fingers pressed the edges of the sheets into tight corners. She glanced over her shoulder toward the living room, where Jacob was still fast asleep. "Come on, little guy," she muttered to herself as she walked back to him. She crouched down, placing a hand on his back and gently rubbing in slow circles. "Jacob, hey, it's time to move, buddy," she said softly, her voice calm and tender. He stirred, his eyes blinking slowly like he wasn't sure where he was. His face twisted with confusion for a moment before recognition settled in. "Where's my dad?" he asked, his voice groggy and small. Emily sat on the edge of the couch, resting a hand on his shoulder. "He's still at the hospital, but he's doing okay. He's stable, remember? That's a good thing." Jacob nodded sleepily, his head sinking back into the cushion. "Can I stay here?" he mumbled, eyes half closed. Emily smiled softly, her heart warming in a way she wasn't ready for. "You're not staying here, buddy. You're staying in a real bed," she said, tapping his shoulder gently. Come on. You'll sleep better, I promise. He didn't argue, but he didn't move either. His little arms stretched up toward her in that wordless way kids have of saying, "Carry me." Emily's lips curved into a small, tired smile. All right, you win," she muttered. She slipped her arms under him, lifting him carefully. His head rested on her shoulder almost instantly, his small, warm breath brushing against her neck. He wasn't heavy, but the weight of him felt bigger than it should. It wasn't just the weight of his body, it was the weight of trust. She carried him down the hallway, his legs dangling loosely against her. Each step felt like walking deeper into something she didn't fully understand yet. She reached the guest room and slowly knelt by the bed, lowering him gently onto the mattress. He sank into it like a stone into water, his body curling on its own as soon as it hit the sheets. She pulled the blanket up to his chin and sat on the edge of the bed, watching him for a moment. His eyes stayed closed, his breath slow and steady. "You're safe, Jacob," she whispered, brushing a hand over his hair. "I promise." Her words hung in the air longer than she expected. She stayed there for a while, just listening to the sound of him breathing. But eventually, she stood. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind refused to rest. She left the door open just a crack, in case he woke up and needed her. Back in the kitchen, she leaned on the countertop, eyes fixed on her phone. No new messages. No missed calls. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before she tapped it, opening her contacts. Her eyes scrolled through the list until she found St. John's Hospital. She tapped the number, lifting the phone to her ear. "St. John's Hospital, how can I direct your call?" "Hi, I'm calling about a patient, Ethan Williams," she said, glancing toward the guest room, lowering her voice to avoid waking Jacob. "I'm his wife. I just wanted to see if there were any updates." "Let me check for you, Mrs. Williams. Please hold." Emily pressed her lips together, her fingers drumming lightly on the counter. Her heart thudded slowly in her chest, each beat louder than it should have been. "Ma'am." The nurse's voice returned. "No major updates. His vitals are stable. No complications after surgery. We're monitoring him overnight." Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said softly. Can you tell him Jacob's okay? If he wakes up, I mean." "Of course, I'll add a note to his file," the nurse replied warmly. "Take care, Mrs. Williams." Emily hung up and set the phone down. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the countertop. The exhaustion hit her all at once, like a wave crashing against her back. Her eyes flicked to the guest room door, slightly ajar. She could hear the faint rustle of Jacob moving in his sleep. Her chest tightened with something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was something more. She poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter as she drank it slowly. Her eyes wandered to the small details of her house, the photo of her and her sister, the plants she'd watered every morning, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. It all felt so different now. Her eyes landed on a reflection in the window. Herself. For the first time in a long time, she didn't look small. She didn't look cornered. She didn't look tired in the way she had when Ryan was around. She just looked steady. Her phone buzzed. For a second, her heart jumped. The hospital? No. It was a message. From Ryan. "I'm coming tomorrow for my stuff. Don't touch my things." She stared at the message for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the reply button. She could argue, fight, tell him off. She could. But she didn't. She swiped left and hit block. She turned off the kitchen light, letting the warm glow of the hallway be the only light left. She walked toward the guest room, stopping by the doorway. Jacob was still there, curled up, his breath steady, his face peaceful. Her heart ached, but not in a bad way. It ached the way things ache when you realize you care more than you expected. "Good night, champ," she whispered, leaning against the doorframe. "We're doing okay. We're all doing okay." For the first time that day, she believed it. She closed the door softly, leaving just a crack of light. Then she walked to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and let her body finally rest. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to break. For the first time, she felt like she was building something. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the hospital room. The soft glow of the overhead light cast a pale, sterile brightness on everything it touched, the crisp white sheets, the steel edges of the medical equipment, and the face of Ethan Williams. His eyes were still closed, his face relaxed but marked with faint bruises along his forehead and cheekbone. A thin bandage was wrapped around his head, and the slow rise and fall of his chest beneath the hospital gown was the only proof that he was still there, still fighting. Emily sat beside him, her fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on her sweater sleeve. Her eyes never left his face. She'd been there for hours, her exhaustion well past the point of sleep. She wasn't even sure why she'd come so early, but after dropping Jacob off at school that morning, her car had just ended up here. Like something inside her had pulled her in this direction. Her gaze flicked toward the machines beside the bed. Green lines danced steadily across the monitor, each one marking the passing of another moment. Her eyes traced the rise and fall of those little peaks. Up, down. Up, down. The rhythm was almost hypnotic. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her hands folded under her chin. "You made it through the hardest part, Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a breath. "You're stable, you're safe. You just need to wake up now." Her eyes flickered with a quiet kind of frustration, the kind that comes from caring too much for something that isn't yours to care for. "You have a kid waiting for you," she added, her voice firm this time. "A little boy who's counting on you to keep your promise. Remember? You told him you'd pick him up after school." Her eyes dropped to his hand, lying motionless on the bed beside him. Without thinking, she reached out and wrapped her fingers around his. His skin was warm, and that warmth surprised her. Somehow, she'd expected him to feel cold. But he wasn't. He was here. Her thumb moved gently along the edge of his knuckles. "You don't get to break that promise, Ethan," she murmured. "He's already had enough broken ones." Her head bowed slightly, her hair falling over her face like a curtain. She closed her eyes, letting herself breathe slowly, in sync with the steady beeping of the monitor. Then it happened. A shift. A twitch. Her eyes flew open, her gaze darting to their joined hands. She felt it again, the faintest, smallest squeeze from his fingers. It wasn't much, just a tiny pulse of movement, but it was there. "Ethan," she said quickly, her eyes wide. She leaned forward, clutching his hand tighter. "Ethan, can you hear me? Come on, you can do this." His eyes didn't open right away, but his brow furrowed slightly, the faintest wrinkle forming between his eyebrows. His lips parted, and for a moment, she thought she heard him exhale just a little louder than before. "That's it," she said, her voice rising in encouragement. "Come on, Ethan. Open your eyes. You're safe. You're not alone." Her heart pounded as his eyelids twitched, his lashes fluttering like they were too heavy to lift. But slowly, painfully slowly, his eyes opened to thin slits. At first, he squinted, his eyes cloudy with confusion. He blinked once, twice, his gaze drifting aimlessly around the room. He seemed to struggle, his eyes fighting to focus. Hey, you're okay," Emily said, leaning forward so she was in his line of sight. "It's okay. Take your time. You're in the hospital, but you're safe. You're safe, Ethan." His eyes finally found her, his pupils still unfocused but locked on hers. She saw it then, recognition. Not full understanding, but something familiar. His lips moved, dry and cracked, but no words came out. Emily grabbed the cup of water from the bedside table, quickly inserting the straw and bringing it to his mouth. "Here, sip slowly," she instructed, gently tilting the cup. He took a small sip, his throat working as he swallowed. His eyes closed for a second, but when they opened again, they were clearer. His gaze fixed on her with more intention this time. "Who?" he croaked, his voice like sandpaper. "Emily," she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm Emily. I was there when it happened. I stayed with you." His eyes narrowed slightly, trying to piece it together. He glanced around the room, taking in the machines, the wires attached to him, the white walls of the hospital. His breathing hitched. Panic. She saw it in his eyes before it fully set in. Hey, slow down," she said quickly, standing and placing her hands lightly on his shoulders. "You're safe. You're safe. You had an accident, but you're okay now. Just breathe, Ethan. Breathe." He blinked at her, his chest rising and falling with quick, uneven breaths. But her voice cut through the haze. Slowly, his breathing began to match hers, slower, deeper. "Jacob," he rasped suddenly, his eyes darting toward her with sharp clarity. "Jacob. Where's Jacob?" Emily's heart twisted at the sound of his name. She crouched down so they were eye level again, her hands still resting gently on his shoulders. "He's okay, Ethan. He's at school, and he's safe. I've been taking care of him. I promise, he's okay." His shoulders relaxed, his body sinking deeper into the mattress as if the weight of the world had just been lifted off him. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breath slow and steady. He hates being alone," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's throat tightened, and she smiled softly, her eyes stinging with the burn of unshed tears. "He's not alone, Ethan. Not anymore," she said. They stayed like that for a while. Ethan's eyes opened and closed, his body worn down from the effort of simply being awake. Emily didn't rush him. She stayed by his side, her hand still wrapped around his. Then the door creaked open. A small voice echoed into the room. "Dad?" Both Emily and Ethan turned toward the doorway at the same time. There he was. Jacob stood in the doorway, his backpack hanging loosely from one arm, his eyes wide and filled with a cautious kind of hope. He looked at Emily first, his gaze asking a silent question. She nodded once, her eyes brimming with warmth. "Go on, buddy," she said softly, tilting her head toward the bed. Jacob didn't need to be told twice. He dropped his backpack and ran toward the bed, his sneakers squeaking on the tile floor. He climbed up on the edge, his small hands gripping the bed rail as he stared at his father like he was looking at a miracle. "Dad! You're awake. You're awake." Jacob's voice cracked with emotion as he leaned forward, his face just inches from Ethan's. Ethan's eyes, still heavy with exhaustion, locked on his son. Tears filled his eyes, spilling down his bruised cheeks. He tried to lift his hand, but it shook from weakness. It didn't matter. Jacob grabbed it, gripping it tightly in both of his small hands. "Hey, champ," Ethan whispered, his voice rough but full of love. "I told you. I'd be there." Jacob laughed through his tears, his face pressed against his father's arm. "I knew you'd come back," he mumbled, his words muffled against the fabric of the hospital gown. "I knew it." Emily leaned back, her hands covering her face for a moment as she breathed deeply. She felt something break inside her, not in a bad way, but in the way something fragile breaks to make space for something new. When she looked back at them, Jacob was still holding his father's hand, his small frame resting against Ethan's arm like it was the safest place in the world. Ethan's eyes met hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. Emily smiled, her heart so full it hurt. "Don't thank me yet," she replied with a playful tilt of her head. "You still owe me a promise." Ethan frowned, confused. "What promise?" Emily glanced at Jacob, who grinned through his tears. "Ice cream," she said simply. Ethan let out a hoarse laugh that turned into a cough. But even through it, he smiled. "Ice cream it is," he whispered. The soft hum of the hospital room was calmer now. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had become background noise, blending with the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and clean linens. Ethan was more alert this time. His face still bore the marks of the accident, the bruises along his jaw, the faint cuts near his temple, but his eyes were clear. Tired, but clear. His head rested comfortably on the pillow, and his breathing was steady. Jacob sat on the bed beside him, leaning against his father's side like he belonged there. One of his small hands was wrapped firmly around Ethan's wrist, as if letting go wasn't an option. Every now and then, he would look up at his dad to make sure he was still awake, and Ethan would glance down and offer him a small, tired smile. Emily sat in the chair next to them, her legs crossed, her arms resting on her lap. Her eyes flicked between Ethan and Jacob, taking them both in like she was capturing a picture in her mind. The scene was so simple, so normal, and yet, it wasn't. It wasn't normal for strangers to become something more. It wasn't normal to feel like this. But here she was. Jacob's head tilted up, his eyes squinting like he was thinking hard. "Dad, when you get out of here, can we still go to the park?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet hope. Ethan glanced at him, his eyes soft with love. He squeezed Jacob's small hand. "Yeah, buddy. We can go to the park. Swings, slides, all of it," he said, his voice still a little rough from disuse, but steady enough. "Might take me a little while to get my superhero strength back, but we'll get there." Jacob's face lit up with a grin. "You can be slow. I'll push you on the swing," he said proudly, puffing out his chest like he'd just solved a major problem. Emily laughed softly, tilting her head as she watched them. "Sounds like a solid plan, champ," she said, smiling warmly. Ethan glanced at her then, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer than usual. His eyes searched hers, quiet but intense, like he was looking for something. She noticed it but didn't look away. For a second, it felt like they were the only two people in the room. He exhaled a slow breath, blinking away whatever thought had crossed his mind. "Emily," he said suddenly, his tone more serious this time. Her eyebrows raised slightly. "Yeah." He hesitated, his lips pressing into a line like he was trying to find the right words. His eyes darted toward Jacob, who was busy swinging his legs off the edge of the bed, oblivious to the shift in energy. I don't think I ever really thanked you," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, but not from weakness. It was the weight of honesty. Emily tilted her head. "You've thanked me 100 times already, Ethan," she replied with a half-smile. "You don't owe me anything." His eyes locked on hers, sharp and steady this time. "No, I do," he said firmly. "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to pick up Jacob. You didn't have to walk into my life and just be there like you've always been there." Her breath caught in her chest. She wasn't ready for this, for that. She glanced at Jacob, but he was too busy playing with the edge of the hospital blanket to notice. "You're giving me too much credit, Ethan," she said softly, looking down at her hands. "I was just doing what anyone would do." He shook his head, his lips curving into a crooked smile. "No. Not anyone would," he replied, his eyes never leaving her. Her chest tightened at that. She felt something in the air shift, like an invisible string had just been pulled between them. Before she could respond, Jacob's voice broke the moment. "Can Emily live with us, Dad?" he asked casually, as if he were asking for dessert after dinner. Emily's eyes widened. Jacob, she said, her voice filled with playful shock. That's not how this works, buddy. Jacob frowned, his small face scrunching up in confusion. Why not? He asked, tilting his head. You already stay with me. You pick me up from school. You even make dinner better than Dad. Ethan barked out a short laugh, wincing slightly as he placed a hand on his ribs. Careful, champ. You're gonna hurt my pride, he said, shaking his head. Jacob shrugged, completely unapologetic. It's true. She makes those little pancakes with the chocolate chips. You just make the circle kind, Jacob muttered, kicking his legs lazily. Emily pressed her lips together, trying not to laugh. I can't argue with that, Ethan admitted, glancing at Emily with that same look from earlier, the quiet, steady, unspoken kind. The playful air faded slowly, and once again, the room grew still. Ethan leaned his head back against the pillow, his eyes staring at the ceiling for a moment before shifting back to her. Jacob's got a point, he said casually, but his tone was anything but. Emily tilted her head, watching him closely. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan let out a slow breath, his eyes flickering from her to Jacob, then back to her. He reached over with the hand that wasn't hooked up to monitors, his fingers slow but deliberate as they reached toward hers. She froze, watching his hand move like she wasn't sure if she should meet him halfway. But she did. Her fingers slid into his, their hands fitting together so naturally that it almost startled her. Her eyes shot up to his, searching for something, a joke, maybe, a smirk, but there wasn't one. Just him. Stay, he said softly, his voice so quiet she almost thought she misheard him. Her breath hitched. Ethan, she began, her voice already shaking with doubt. You're on pain meds. You don't mean that. He shook his head slowly. I mean it, he said firmly, his grip on her hand tightening just a little. Stay. Not just for Jacob. Not just until I get back on my feet. Stay for good. Her heart thudded in her chest, loud and unsteady. She could feel it echoing in her ears. That's not something you just say, Ethan, she replied, her eyes sharp but her voice soft. That's something you have to think about. Really think about. I have, he said, tilting his head to look at her fully. I've been thinking about it since the second I woke up and saw you sitting there. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She stared at him, searching for signs of doubt, for hesitation, for anything that would let her brush it off as a joke. But there was nothing. Just him. Just the same man who told his son he'd keep his promise. Jacob, still swinging his legs, piped up like he'd been listening the whole time. I already told her to stay, Dad. I don't know why you're making it a big deal, he said, rolling his eyes like adults are so slow sometimes. Emily let out a short, breathy laugh, wiping the corners of her eyes before anything spilled over. Looks like I'm outnumbered, huh? She muttered, shaking her head. Ethan smiled at her, that quiet, steady kind of smile. Yeah, you are, he said, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. So, stay. Emily exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a moment before opening them again. She looked at Ethan, then at Jacob, then back at Ethan. You're lucky I like you too, she muttered, squeezing his hand. Jacob grinned wide, throwing his hands up like they'd won a game. Yes. We got her. He shouted, laughing so hard he almost fell off the bed. Ethan just stared at her, his eyes warm and unshaken. Yeah, champ, he said softly, his eyes still locked on hers. We got her. The late afternoon sun poured through the living room window, streaks of golden light cutting across the hardwood floor. Dust particles floated lazily in the air, spinning in slow motion like they had nowhere else to be. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but expectant, like the calm just before a storm. Emily sat on the couch, her elbows on her knees, hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes flickered toward the clock on the wall. 4:27 p.m. He'd said 4 o'clock. Her foot tapped anxiously against the floor, soft and steady, like the ticking of a metronome. Jacob was at the kitchen table, quietly coloring with his headphones on. He hummed to himself, completely unaware of the storm about to walk through the front door. Emily glanced at him, her heart settling a little at the sight of him. She wanted him to stay like that, safe, untouched by the weight of adult problems. Then, it happened. The jingle of keys. The rattle of the doorknob. Emily's whole body went still, like a deer catching the scent of something dangerous. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists against her knees. The door swung open. Ryan stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway like a shadow blocking out the sun. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He never did. His eyes scanned the room as if it still belonged to him. "Thought I said I'd be here at 4, he muttered, letting the door swing shut behind him. Emily didn't answer. She stayed seated, eyes locked on him, her face calm but her eyes sharp. Ryan glanced toward the kitchen, spotting Jacob with his headphones on. He scoffed. "Didn't know you were running a daycare now," he said with a dry laugh, tossing his keys onto the counter like he used to. "Don't touch my counters, Ryan," Emily said flatly, her eyes never leaving him. He froze for a second, then slowly turned toward her, his eyes narrowing with that familiar look, the one that always came right before the arguments. "Oh, we're doing this again," he said, his voice laced with mockery. He stepped toward her, slow and deliberate. "Gonna act all tough now that you got some guest in the house? Is that it?" Emily leaned back against the couch, tilting her head, eyes locked on him with unnerving calm. "I'm not acting, Ryan," she said quietly. "I've had enough of acting." Her words hit him harder than she expected. His jaw clenched, his hands flexing at his sides. "Right," he muttered, nodding to himself. "So you think you're better now, huh? You think you're better than me just because you got a little space to breathe?" Emily let out a breath, long and steady. She stood up slowly, every movement deliberate. No rush. No fear. Just control. "No, Ryan, I don't think I'm better than you," she said, her eyes leveled on his. "But I do know I'm better without you." Her words sliced through the air, sharp and final. Ryan's face twitched, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for something to grab onto. His pride, maybe. "You think you can just throw me out of my own house?" he asked, taking a step toward her. Emily tilted her head, her gaze never leaving his. "It's not your house, Ryan. It stopped being yours the day you stopped treating it like a home," she replied, her voice like steel. "Your stuff is packed by the door. Take it and go." She glanced toward the front door where 2 neatly stacked boxes sat by the wall, labeled with thick black marker, "Ryan's stuff." He turned his head, spotting the boxes. His face twisted into something ugly, part rage, part disbelief. "You packed my stuff?" he muttered, his eyes narrowing to slits. "You think you get to do that?" He took another step forward, his eyes locked on her like a predator sizing up his prey. "Careful, Ryan," Emily warned, her voice dropping low. "Jacob's right there." That stopped him. His head snapped toward the kitchen, where Jacob was still drawing, headphones on, blissfully unaware of the tension in the air. Ryan's eyes flicked back to Emily. His nostrils flared. "You using that kid as a shield now? That's low, Em. Real low," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Emily's eyes flashed with something dangerous. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. She tilted her head up to meet his gaze directly. "No, Ryan," she said slowly, each word like a bullet. "I'm showing him how to stand up to people who think they can walk in and take whatever they want. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Ryan stared at her, his jaw tight, his breathing sharp. For a second, she thought he might say something, yell, argue, do something. But he didn't. He just stood there, looking at her like she was someone he didn't recognize. "You've changed," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Emily raised her chin, her eyes clear and steady. "Yeah, I have," she said firmly. "And that's why you're leaving." Her words hung in the air, solid and undeniable. Ryan turned slowly toward the boxes by the door. He stared at them like they'd personally offended him. His shoulders tensed, his fingers flexed, but eventually, he picked up the first box. "You think this is over?" he muttered, his eyes locked on the wall ahead of him, not daring to look at her. Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. He grabbed the second box, shifting them both in his arms. His footsteps were heavy as he walked toward the door. He yanked it open, stepping halfway out before turning his head over his shoulder. "You'll miss me, Emily," he said, his smile bitter and full of false confidence. "You'll see." Emily didn't blink. "I already don't," she replied. His face twitched. He stepped outside, letting the door slam behind him with a loud bang that echoed through the house. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It wasn't sharp. It was clean. Emily stayed where she was for a moment, her eyes locked on the door. Her chest rose and fell slowly, each breath filling her with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She turned, her eyes flicking to Jacob at the kitchen table. His headphones were still on, his crayon slowly filling in the bright red cape of a superhero on his paper. His tongue peeked out from the corner of his mouth as he focused on staying inside the lines. Emily's heart ached in the best possible way. She walked over to him, crouching down beside him. "Hey, buddy," she said softly, resting a hand on his back. He looked up at her, pulling one side of his headphones down. "HM?" She glanced toward the door, then back at him, her eyes warm and steady. "Just wanted to tell you I'm proud of you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Jacob tilted his head, confused. "Why?" "I'm just coloring," he said, pointing at his superhero drawing. Emily smiled, brushing her hand over his hair. "Doesn't matter," she replied, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "I'm still proud of you." Jacob's face softened, his eyes flicking to his drawing before looking back at her. "Thanks, Emily," he said, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "Anytime, champ," she said, her voice thick with something she wasn't ready to name. She glanced toward the door one last time. No more shouting. No more slamming doors. No more walking on eggshells. The storm was over. And for the first time in a long time, Emily knew it wouldn't be coming back. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden streaks of light across the front lawn. The warmth of late afternoon seeped in through the open windows of Ethan's house, carrying with it the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustle of leaves swaying in the breeze. The air smelled clean, fresh, and for once, it felt like the world itself had slowed down. Inside, the house was quiet but not in a lonely way. It was the kind of quiet that felt lived in, like the calm after a long day filled with movement and warmth. In the living room, Jacob lay sprawled across the large gray couch, his socked feet dangling off the edge as he flipped through the pages of a colorful comic book. His eyes moved rapidly from panel to panel, his face twisting in concentration every time something exciting happened. His giggles would sneak out every few pages, little bursts of joy he didn't even seem to notice himself. On the other side of the room, Ethan sat in a recliner, his leg propped up on a pillow, his ribs still tightly bandaged under his t-shirt. His recovery had been slower than he'd expected, but today, for the first time, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. His eyes weren't on the TV, despite it being on. He was watching Jacob. He leaned his head back, exhaling deeply, letting the moment settle into his chest. Every once in a while, his gaze flickered to the kitchen. He could hear Emily moving around, the soft clinking of dishes, the faint sound of running water. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't stressed. She was just there. Present. He felt it in his bones, the feeling of something solid. "You doing okay over there, tough guy?" Emily's voice called from the kitchen. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with ease. Ethan smiled to himself before turning his head toward her. She was wiping down the counter with a dishcloth, her hair tied up in a loose bun, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. "What? You forget how to answer a question?" she teased, tossing the dishcloth over her shoulder. "Nah, just forgot how nice it is to have someone asking," Ethan replied, his grin lazy but genuine. Emily paused for a second, her eyes flicking to his like she was trying to figure out if he was being sincere. But when she saw the softness in his face, she smiled back, shaking her head like he was a little too smooth for his own good. "Well, you better get used to it, Williams," she said, turning back to the counter. "Not going anywhere." Her words hung in the air longer than she probably meant them to, but neither of them moved to take them back. Jacob glanced up from his comic book, looking at both of them like he'd just realized something. "You guys sound like you're married," he said, his face twisted in that blunt, honest way only kids can pull off. Emily barked out a short laugh, her hands on her hips as she leaned against the counter. "Oh, do we now?" she asked, smirking. "Is that what it sounds like?" Jacob nodded firmly, his eyes still on them like he was studying a rare species of animal. "Yep. Just like in The Guardians. The big guy and the smart one who pretends she doesn't care, but she does," he said, going back to his comic. Ethan chuckled, glancing at Emily. "Guess I'm the big guy in this scenario, huh?" he asked, tilting his head toward her. "More like the stubborn one who never asks for help until he's bleeding," Emily shot back with a grin. Jacob snorted so hard he almost dropped his comic book. "She's not wrong, Dad," he added with a grin, still flipping pages. "Traitor," Ethan muttered, shaking his head with mock defeat. Emily grabbed a bowl of fresh strawberries from the counter and walked over, sitting on the couch next to Jacob. She nudged him lightly with her elbow, holding out the bowl. "Want some?" she asked. Jacob didn't hesitate. He grabbed two at once, stuffing one in his mouth immediately while holding the other like a prized possession. "Thanks, Emily," he mumbled through a full mouth. "Manners, champ," Ethan called out, pointing at him with mock sternness. Jacob swallowed quickly, then shouted back. "Thank you, Miss Emily," he said, his voice full of dramatic flair. Emily leaned her head back on the couch, covering her face with her hands as she laughed. Her whole body shook with it, and Ethan watched her with a look he hadn't worn in a long, long time. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper. "You should laugh like that more," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear. Emily lowered her hands, looking at him with a playful squint. "Oh yeah? Why's that?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. "Because it makes the whole house feel different," he replied, his eyes on her, unflinching. "Lighter. Safer. Feels like home." Her breath hitched, her gaze locking on his. There it was again, that invisible thread between them, tugging tighter. She felt it. She knew he felt it too. But she didn't run from it. Not this time. She leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. "Maybe it's not the house that changed, Ethan," she said softly, glancing at Jacob, who was too focused on his comic to hear them. Her eyes flicked back to him. "Maybe it's the people in it." Ethan tilted his head, his eyes narrowing like he was really thinking about that. His smile grew slowly, like it had to work its way up from deep inside him. "Yeah, maybe," he agreed, nodding once. "People can do that sometimes." Silence settled between them again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was warm. Full. Emily leaned back into the couch, eyes closed for just a second. "So, what's for dinner, big guy?" she asked, peeking at him from one eye. Ethan laughed, leaning his head back on the recliner. "Oh, so I'm cooking now?" "Thought you were the smart one in this Guardians team," he replied, his grin sharp. Emily shrugged. "Smart enough to know when to delegate," she said, tossing a strawberry in her mouth with a satisfied smile. Jacob shot up from his spot on the couch, his eyes wide with excitement. "Tacos! We should have tacos!" he shouted, holding up his comic book like it was part of the plan. "The heroes always eat tacos after they win the big fight." Emily glanced at Ethan, raising her eyebrows like she had just been convinced by a brilliant argument. "He's not wrong," she said. Ethan rolled his eyes, groaning as he slowly pushed himself up from the recliner, his ribs protesting with every movement. "Fine, fine. Tacos it is," he grumbled, stretching his back carefully. "But you're both on prep duty. No freeloaders in this house." Jacob jumped up, hands in the air like he'd just scored a goal. "I call cheese duty," he shouted, running toward the kitchen. Emily stood up, glancing at Ethan. "You heard the man," she said, tilting her head toward the kitchen. "Cheese duty's a big job. You better make sure he doesn't overthrow you as head of the house." Ethan walked toward her, stopping just for a moment. His eyes met hers. "Pretty sure we both know who runs this house," he said softly, his eyes full of quiet admiration. Her smile was small but unshakable. "Yeah, we do," she replied, her gaze steady as ever. They stood there for a second longer, just breathing in the quiet joy of it all. No tension. No fear. Just this. The smell of fresh tortillas filled the air a few minutes later, mixing with the sound of Jacob's wild commentary from the kitchen. Plates clattered. Laughter echoed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't neat. But it was theirs. Their family. And it felt like home. The sun had nearly set, casting streaks of deep orange and soft pink across the sky. The warm glow spilled through the wide glass doors at the back of Ethan's house, painting the kitchen walls with soft, golden hues. The smell of freshly made tacos still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of lime and cilantro. Plates sat stacked neatly on the counter, the kitchen now quiet after the whirlwind of dinner prep. Jacob was on the living room floor, sprawled out on his stomach with crayons scattered around him. His head was bent low, his tongue poking out slightly as he focused hard on coloring the cape of his superhero drawing. He hummed to himself, occasionally glancing up to check the TV playing quietly in the background. At the kitchen sink, Emily stood with her sleeves rolled up, hands submerged in soapy water. She was scrubbing a frying pan, the bubbles swishing back and forth as she worked. Her eyes flicked toward Jacob every few seconds like it had become second nature to check on him. "You don't have to do all that, you know," Ethan said from behind her, his voice warm but a little rough from the strain of the day. Emily glanced over her shoulder to see him leaning against the counter, his arms crossed casually. He still had that "I'm supposed to be resting" look about him, but it was clear he had no intention of staying put. "You can barely walk straight, Ethan," she shot back, turning her attention to the pan. "The last thing I need is you hobbling over here trying to wash dishes." He chuckled, his smile slow and lopsided. "Fair point," he admitted, walking toward her slowly, careful with every step. "But I'm not talking about dishes." Emily paused, her hands stopping in the soapy water. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't turn around. "Then what are you talking about?" she asked, her voice calm but curious. She heard his footsteps come closer, slow but steady. Her heart did something strange, that little skip that happens when something important is about to be said. She kept her hands in the sink, eyes focused on the water, like if she moved too fast, she'd disrupt whatever moment was building behind her. Ethan stopped just a few feet away. She felt him there before he even spoke. "I'm talking about this," he said, his voice lower now, softer but certain. "All of it. You, me, Jacob. This house." Her heart gave that little skip again. This time, it didn't stop. Slowly, she pulled her hands out of the water, drying them on a dish towel. She turned around, leaning back against the counter, eyes locked on him. "Okay, Williams," she said, her voice steady but her eyes sharp. "Go ahead. Say what you're trying so hard to say." Ethan huffed out a laugh, rubbing the back of his neck with one hand like he'd been caught doing something embarrassing. His gaze dropped to the floor for a second before rising to meet hers. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes were unshaken. "Stay," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Stay with us. Not just for now. Not just because it's convenient. Stay for good." Emily blinked, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. "Ethan," she started, her voice soft but full of caution. "I'm serious, Em," he said, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've been thinking about it for weeks. Watching you with Jacob. Watching you with me. You didn't just fill in the gaps while I was down. You didn't just help us. You changed us." Her throat tightened, her hands gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "That's not fair, Ethan," she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward Jacob on the floor. He was still coloring, still humming, completely oblivious. "You're only saying this because everything feels good right now. The second things get hard." "Things are hard, Emily," Ethan cut in, his voice firmer now. "Things have been hard. I know hard. I've lived it. This," he motioned toward her, toward Jacob, toward the house, "this is different. This is the first time in a long time I've felt like I'm not carrying everything alone." Her breath caught. She hated how much that hit her. How much it made her want to believe him. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, taking another step forward. His voice was quieter this time, like he was trying to be careful with her, like he knew how fragile this moment was. "I just needed you to know where I stand. I don't want you to feel like you're here because of obligation or guilt." His eyes softened, his voice dropping even lower. "I want you here because you want to be here." Her chest ached. It ached with something so big, so unfamiliar, that she didn't know if it was fear or love or both tangled up together. Her eyes glanced back toward Jacob. He was still scribbling with a bright blue crayon, his tongue peeking out as he concentrated. Completely unaware of the quiet, heavy moment happening just a few feet behind him. Her eyes moved back to Ethan. "You really mean that, huh?" she asked, her voice quieter now, like she was testing the weight of her own words. Ethan nodded, slow and sure. "Yeah, Em," he said, his eyes clear as day. "I mean it." For the first time, Emily didn't look away. She didn't drop her gaze or deflect with a joke. She just stood there, holding his gaze like it was a lifeline. Her breathing was slow, steady. Her fingers tapped against the counter once, twice. Then she nodded. "All right, Williams," she said, her voice stronger now, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "If you're serious, then so am I." Ethan's eyebrows lifted, surprise flashing across his face before it melted into a grin. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief and relief all at once. "Yeah," she replied, smiling wider now. "But don't think this gets you out of dish duty." Ethan threw his head back with a loud, hearty laugh, and for a moment, he looked so much lighter. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long, and now it had finally been set down. "Deal," he said, holding up both hands like he was surrendering. "I'll do the dishes. You just stick around." She laughed too, the kind of laugh that fills a room and stays there even after it's quiet again. "Looks like you two are getting married," Jacob's voice came suddenly from the floor. Emily's head whipped toward him, eyes wide in disbelief. "What did you just say?" she asked, her mouth open in mock shock. Jacob grinned at her, his eyes still on his drawing. "I said you guys sound like you're getting married," he repeated, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Emily glanced at Ethan, who was watching her with a look so soft, so full, that her heart gave that familiar, traitorous skip. "Don't give him any ideas, kid," she said, pointing a playful warning finger at Jacob. Ethan tilted his head, his grin slow and sly. "Too late," he muttered, his eyes still locked on hers. Emily laughed again, but this time, she felt something shift in her chest, something warm, steady, and good. Jacob glanced up at them from his spot on the floor, his grin wide as ever. "I hope you do," he said simply, like it was already a fact. "Then you can be my real mom." Silence. Thick, but not heavy. Emily glanced at Ethan, and he was already looking at her. Not a single word passed between them, but somehow, it felt like everything had already been said. Her smile returned, slow but certain. "We'll see, champ," she said softly, eyes still on Ethan. "We'll see." And in that moment, with the sun setting behind them and the world quieting into the evening, it felt like they'd already made their choice. Not with words, but with each other. Night had fully settled over the house. The warm glow of soft yellow lamps illuminated the living room, casting long, gentle shadows on the walls. Outside, crickets chirped steadily, filling the quiet spaces between the sounds of the house. It wasn't loud. It wasn't busy. It was home. Jacob lay curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over him like a cocoon. His head rested on Emily's lap, his breathing deep and even as he sank into sleep. His little hands twitched occasionally, like he was dreaming of running or flying. His superhero drawing was still crumpled in his other hand, his fingers curled around it protectively. Emily sat with her back against the cushions, one hand gently resting on Jacob's back. Her thumb moved in small, slow circles, a motion so natural she hadn't even realized she was doing it. Her other hand was propped on the armrest, holding a lukewarm mug of tea she hadn't sipped in a while. Her eyes weren't on Jacob. They were on Ethan. He was on the recliner, his legs still propped up on a pillow, his head tilted to the side as if he tried to stay awake but lost the battle. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady. His t-shirt had shifted slightly, revealing the edge of the bandages wrapped around his ribs. He hadn't complained once all night, but she knew from the way he moved that it still hurt. Stubborn man, she thought, lips tugging into a small smile. Her gaze lingered on him longer than she meant it to. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way his arms hung lazily at his sides like he'd finally let himself rest. She wasn't sure when it happened, but at some point, her heart had shifted from worried caretaker to something else. She didn't run from that thought this time. Her eyes flickered back to Jacob, her fingers still tracing soft circles on his back. He sighed deeply in his sleep, his tiny body relaxing even further into her lap. She tilted her head, letting out a quiet breath. This was it, wasn't it? This was the moment she realized she wasn't just a visitor in their lives. She hadn't just helped out. She'd stayed. She'd made space for them, and somehow, they'd made space for her too. Her phone buzzed softly on the table next to her. She glanced at it, careful not to shift too much and wake Jacob. The screen lit up with a text from her sister, "Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" Emily stared at the message for a moment longer than necessary, her eyes thoughtful. She tapped a quick reply with one hand. "Yeah, I'm good. Better than good, actually." Her thumb hovered for a second before she added, "I think I found my place." She hit send. A soft grunt came from the recliner, pulling her attention. Ethan shifted, his eyes fluttering open slowly. He blinked a few times, squinting at the soft glow of the room. His gaze scanned the space before settling on her. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice hoarse with sleep. "You're one to talk," she said, lifting her mug as if to say, "What's your excuse?" He huffed a small laugh, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position. His hand pressed lightly against his ribs, but he didn't complain. His eyes landed on Jacob, his face softening instantly. "He's out cold, huh?" Ethan muttered, his gaze warm with affection. "Completely," Emily replied, her voice low so she wouldn't wake him. He fought it for a while, kept mumbling about wanting to finish his drawing. Next thing I know, he's snoring like a little bear. Ethan's eyes crinkled at the corners as he grinned. "Sounds about right," he said softly, his gaze still on his son. For a moment, his eyes lingered there, filled with that quiet kind of love that doesn't need words. Then he glanced at Emily, and something shifted in the air. His eyes stayed on her, steady and thoughtful. "You good?" he asked, his voice quieter this time, more personal. She blinked, glancing at Jacob like she needed an extra second to think. Her fingers kept moving on his back, slow and steady. "Yeah," she said finally, looking back at Ethan. "I think I am." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a quiet understanding between them. No big speeches, no grand declarations. Just the kind of understanding that happens when two people have seen each other at their worst and stayed anyway. They didn't say anything for a while. Just sat there, watching Jacob sleep, breathing in the peace of the house. It wasn't until Ethan broke the silence that the weight of everything really hit her. "I used to think it was just me and him, you know," he said, his voice distant, like he was remembering something far away. His eyes stayed on Jacob. "Thought that was how it was always gonna be. Just us. Two people trying to make up for all the pieces that went missing." Emily didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "Then you showed up," he continued, his eyes flicking to hers for a moment before looking away. "And it didn't feel like two anymore. It felt like three." Her breath caught in her chest. She swallowed thickly, her gaze dropping to the sleeping boy in her lap. "Three's a good number," she said softly, her voice quiet but certain. "Feels even. Balanced." He smiled at that. A small, tired smile, but a real one. "Yeah, it does," he agreed, letting his head fall back against the recliner. Another stretch of silence passed, but this time, it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything they didn't have to say out loud. Eventually, Ethan shifted, leaning forward slightly, his gaze sharper now. "You know, Jacob's been asking me something lately," he said, his tone casual but his eyes focused. Emily tilted her head, curious. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Ethan's lips tugged into a grin that didn't quite match the seriousness in his eyes. "He keeps asking when I'm gonna make it official," he said, his eyebrows lifting like it was a challenge. "Said if I don't, he's just gonna do it himself." Emily frowned, her confusion turning into suspicion. "Official? Official what?" He didn't answer right away. He reached down slowly, careful with his ribs, and pulled something from the side pocket of the recliner. A small, square, velvet box. Her heart stopped. No. No, 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 no. He's not. He was. Ethan held up the box with 2 fingers, giving her a slow, steady look. No hesitation. No nerves. Just clarity. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted from him to the box, back to him, then back to the box. "Before you say anything," he started, his voice still calm, "still him, this isn't one of those, pressure you into something, kinda deals. I'm not doing this 'cause I'm afraid to lose you. I'm doing it 'cause I already know I won't." Her heart pounded so hard she swore he could hear it. "Ethan," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't need an answer right now," he said, his grin soft and patient. "Just think about it. That's all I'm asking." He placed the box on the coffee table in front of them, not pushing it toward her, not asking her to pick it up. Just there. No pressure. No demands. Emily stared at it, her fingers still on Jacob's back, her heart still running wild. Her eyes flicked up to Ethan, and she saw it, the kind of love that isn't loud or flashy, but steady. Unshakable. Her breath came out in a slow, shaky exhale. "You're something else, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, I know," he replied, his grin lazy but certain. Her eyes moved to the box again. It didn't feel scary anymore. It felt right. 3. 3 was a good number. Morning light streamed softly through the sheer curtains, casting golden stripes across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet in that special way it only is in the early hours, not silent, but calm. Birds chirped outside, and the faint hum of the refrigerator hummed steadily in the background. Emily sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee. The rich, earthy scent filled the air, but she hadn't taken a sip yet. Her eyes were fixed on the small velvet box sitting in front of her. It hadn't moved since Ethan had placed it there last night. Her fingers tapped lightly on the side of the mug, her eyes locked on that little box like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She wasn't afraid of it. Not exactly. But it had a weight far heavier than its size. Her mind was louder than the house around her. What if it's too soon? What if you're just caught up in the moment? What if you're wrong about all of this? Her fingers stopped tapping. Her eyes narrowed. What if I'm right? She muttered to herself. Her gaze softened. She exhaled slowly, her breath warming her hands against the mug. Her eyes flicked to the hallway where Ethan was still asleep. She knew he wouldn't be up for at least another hour. His recovery had forced him to slow down in a way that didn't come naturally to him, but he was doing it. Jacob, on the other hand, was already up. She could hear him in the living room, the quiet sound of pages flipping as he skimmed through his stack of comic books. He wasn't talking to himself like he sometimes did when he read, no sound effects, no imitations of superhero voices. Just the soft rustle of paper. Her eyes drifted back to the box. "All right, Williams, let's see what you're really up to," she whispered, placing her coffee down and reaching forward. Her fingers hovered for a moment, like touching it would set off some kind of alarm. She almost laughed at herself. It's just a box. A tiny little box. But deep down, she knew it was never just a box. With a slow breath, she picked it up, feeling the soft, smooth texture of the velvet under her fingertips. It was smaller than she'd expected, lighter too. But that weight was still there. Her thumb pressed gently against the edge, and with one small movement, she lifted the lid. Her breath caught in her chest. Inside was a simple but stunning ring. It wasn't flashy. No giant, attention-grabbing diamond. Instead, a small, elegant stone sat in the center of a delicate gold band, shining softly in the morning light. It was her. Her lips parted, her chest tightening with something she hadn't expected. It wasn't the ring. It was what it meant. Her eyes flickered back toward the hallway, toward the man still sleeping in the other room. Her heart ached, not with fear, but with knowing. She thought back to everything they'd been through together, every moment that had tested her patience, every choice she'd made, every step she'd taken to be right here. And suddenly, it wasn't scary anymore. It felt easy. Her fingers closed the box slowly, but this time, it wasn't hesitation. It was certainty. She ran her thumb over the top, pressing her lips together as a quiet smile grew on her face. She stood, setting the box back on the table, letting it sit there in the light of the morning. She didn't need to stare at it anymore. The decision had already been made. She walked toward the living room, leaning on the doorway for a moment. Jacob was sitting cross-legged on the rug, his eyes locked on the pages of his comic book. His little face was scrunched up in concentration, his tongue sticking out just slightly as he read. Emily tilted her head, her eyes filling with that quiet kind of love that sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. The kind that doesn't announce itself but settles in like it's been there all along. "You hungry, champ?" she asked softly. Jacob glanced up, blinking like he'd just remembered where he was. "Pancakes?" he asked, hopeful but cautious, like he was already prepared for her to say no. Her smile widened. "Chocolate chip pancakes," she replied, walking toward him. "But only if you help me mix the batter." His face lit up like she'd just handed him the keys to a superhero lair. He scrambled to his feet, his comic book forgotten on the floor. "Deal!" he shouted, running toward the kitchen with all the energy of a kid who just won a prize. Emily followed him, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. An hour later, the smell of pancakes filled the house. The sound of a spatula tapping against the pan echoed through the kitchen, followed by the soft sizzle of batter hitting the hot surface. Jacob stood on a stool next to Emily, holding a small bowl of chocolate chips like it was treasure. "Not too many," she warned with a playful grin, pointing at him with the spatula. Jacob tilted the bowl slowly, his face full of exaggerated focus. "Tell me when," he said, his eyes locked on the pan like he was defusing a bomb. "When," she said after a few seconds, laughing as she watched him tip the bowl just a little too far. Half the bowl of chocolate chips poured out at once, raining into the pancake batter. "Jacob!" she gasped, laughing so hard she had to set the spatula down. "It wasn't me. It was gravity," he said, his hands raised like he was innocent of all charges. Emily shook her head, laughing until her ribs hurt. All right, gravity wins this round," she said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. From behind them, a voice called out. "Smells good in here," Ethan said, his voice low and groggy but full of warmth. Emily turned her head to see him standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame like it was holding him up. His hair was tousled, his t-shirt wrinkled from sleep. He was rubbing the back of his neck, his eyes still a little puffy. Her heart did that thing again, the skip, the shift, the quiet reminder of this is it. "You're just in time, sleepyhead," she said, tilting the spatula toward him. "Chocolate chip pancakes. Blame Jacob for the extra chocolate edition." "It wasn't me, it was gravity," Jacob yelled from his stool, already grinning like he'd won. Ethan's eyes crinkled with a laugh as he limped forward, leaning down to ruffle Jacob's hair. "Gravity, huh? Sneaky little thing," he muttered, glancing at Emily. His eyes softened, his gaze lingering just a little longer than normal. Her smile stayed steady, her chest full of something warm and unshakable. Jacob hopped down from the stool, running toward the living room like he had a mission. "I'm picking the movie today. No arguments," he declared, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily glanced at Ethan, still holding the spatula. He moved closer, his gaze dropping briefly to her hand before flicking back up to meet her eyes. "You look happy," he said quietly, his eyes soft with that familiar warmth. Her lips curved into a smile she didn't even try to fight. "I am," she said simply. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in that curious way he did when he was about to ask her something important. But instead of asking, he just nodded, his grin slow and knowing. He reached over and picked up a chocolate chip from the counter, popping it into his mouth like it was no big deal. "Good," he said, chewing slowly, his eyes still on her. "Feels like you should stay that way." Her eyes flicked toward the velvet box still sitting on the kitchen table. It wasn't heavy anymore. Her gaze returned to Ethan. "I think I will," she replied, her smile small but unshakable. His grin widened, his eyes filled with something she didn't need him to say out loud. She didn't need the words. Because this, the laughter, the pancakes, the messy kitchen, and the quiet certainty in both their eyes, this was the answer. And for the first time, Emily didn't feel like she was waiting for something to change. It already had. She was home. The house buzzed with quiet energy. Not the kind of frantic, chaotic noise that comes with stress, but the kind that comes from life just happening. It was the sound of feet pattering on hardwood floors, cabinets opening and closing, the shuffle of paper as Jacob worked on his school project at the kitchen table. Emily stood at the sink, hands deep in soapy water as she scrubbed a plate with slow, deliberate motions. She wasn't really focused on it. Her eyes kept drifting to the table where Jacob sat, his face scrunched in that same look of intense concentration he wore whenever he was coloring or drawing. His little tongue poked out from the corner of his mouth, his pencil moving carefully across the poster board. He glanced at the instructions next to him, eyebrows knitting together in confusion, and let out a loud sigh like he was carrying the weight of the world. Emily smiled to herself, biting back a laugh. "Everything okay, champ?" she asked, rinsing off the plate and placing it on the drying rack. Jacob dropped his pencil dramatically, throwing his head back like he'd just run a marathon. "No, it's too hard," he groaned. "I have to write a whole paragraph and draw a picture. That's, like, double homework." Emily grabbed a dish towel, drying her hands as she turned to face him, leaning her hip against the counter. "You know, that does sound pretty rough," she said with a mock-serious nod. "A whole paragraph and a picture. I don't know how you're gonna survive." Jacob squinted at her, catching on to her teasing tone. "I'm being serious, Emily," he said, his voice full of dramatic indignation. "Oh, I know," she said, walking over and sitting next to him. She rested her chin on her hand, eyes playful as she looked at his project. "What's it supposed to be about?" Jacob tapped the paper with his pencil. "Family," he muttered. Emily blinked, tilting her head. "Family, huh?" she asked softly. Jacob nodded, still staring at the poster board like it had personally betrayed him. "We're supposed to write about who's in our family and draw a picture of us all together," he explained, his voice quieter now. His fingers fiddled with the edge of the paper. "I don't know how to draw everyone." Her heart gave a small, quiet ache, but she kept her face steady. "Sounds like a pretty important project," she said, picking up one of his colored pencils. She spun it slowly between her fingers, her eyes focused on him. "Who were you thinking of putting in it?" Jacob shrugged, his eyes still on the paper. "Dad," he said, tapping his pencil on one side of the poster. "Me, obviously." "Obviously," Emily repeated, her smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. He glanced at her, his eyes hesitant, like he was about to say something he wasn't sure he was allowed to say. "Can I put you on it too?" he asked, his voice so small it barely reached her. Emily's breath caught. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She blinked quickly, trying to push back the sudden heat behind her eyes. Her hand moved slowly, resting gently on his back. "I think that's a great idea, champ," she said, her voice warm and steady. "If you want me there, I'm there." Jacob's face lit up, like she'd just handed him the missing piece to a puzzle. "Yeah, I do," he said, already picking up his pencil and moving to the blank space on the paper. She watched in silence as he started to draw. First, a circle for her head, then lines for her arms and legs. It was a simple, wobbly stick figure with wild brown hair that looked more like a lion's mane, but she'd never seen anything more perfect. "You gave me super big hair," she said, laughing lightly as she pointed at the drawing. "You do have big hair," Jacob said with complete sincerity, glancing up at her like it was just a fact of life. Emily threw her head back, laughing so hard she had to cover her face with her hands. "I'm not even gonna argue with you, kid," she said, still chuckling. At that moment, Ethan's voice came from the hallway. "What's all this noise in my house?" "Thought I was supposed to be resting," he said, his tone playful but rough with sleep. Emily turned her head to see him walking in slowly, still wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. He moved carefully, his steps slow but steady. He'd gotten better over the past few weeks. The bruises on his face had faded to faint yellow marks, and his ribs didn't seem to bother him as much anymore. "You're not resting, you're just hiding from chores," Emily shot back, raising an eyebrow at him. "She's right, Dad," Jacob said, grinning as he shaded in the stick figure version of Ethan on his poster. "I saw you on the couch with your eyes closed. You weren't fooling anyone." Ethan placed a hand on his chest, faking shock. "Betrayed by my own son," he muttered, shaking his head. "Cold world we live in." He walked over, leaning on the back of Emily's chair, his eyes scanning the poster in front of them. His gaze softened as he saw the little figures drawn on the page, one labeled Dad, one labeled me, and one labeled Emily. His eyes flicked to hers, something unspoken but loud passing between them. She felt it settle in her chest, warm and steady. "Looking good, buddy," Ethan said, his voice quieter now as he ruffled Jacob's hair. Jacob beamed, holding up the paper like it was a masterpiece worthy of display. "Do you think my teacher's gonna like it?" he asked, eyes wide with hope. Emily leaned forward, tilting her head as if she was studying it like an art critic. "Are you kidding?" she said, tapping the corner of the page. "She's gonna frame it and hang it in the front office. Best family portrait I've ever seen." Jacob's grin widened. "You think so?" he asked, his face lighting up with pride. "I know so," she replied, ruffling his hair like Ethan had. Ethan chuckled, his gaze flicking from Jacob to Emily. He tilted his head, his eyes sharp but warm. "You know, we've got a lot of wall space in the hallway," Ethan said, glancing toward the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. "We could frame this one too." Jacob gasped like it was the best idea he'd ever heard. "Yes!" he yelled, holding the paper up with both hands like it was the most valuable treasure on earth. Can we really?" Emily tilted her head at Ethan, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Look at you, Mr. Sentimental," she teased, nudging him with her shoulder. "Don't get used to it," Ethan shot back, grinning at her. But his gaze lingered on her longer than necessary. Her eyes stayed on him too. No words were exchanged, but something in that look felt permanent. "We're framing it, champ," Ethan said, turning to Jacob. "Right in the hallway, where everyone can see it." Jacob nodded like a general making an important decision. "Right in the middle," he said, grinning from ear to ear. Emily glanced at the little stick figure version of herself on the poster, wild hair and all. She reached forward, running her finger gently over the outline, feeling the weight of it settle into her chest. Her family. Not perfect. Not planned. Not anything she could have predicted. But real. And hers. Ethan leaned down beside her, his voice so quiet only she could hear it. "You still thinking about that box on the table?" he asked, his breath warm on her ear. She glanced up at him, her eyes steady but soft. "I'm not thinking, Ethan," she replied quietly. Her fingers brushed lightly against the stick figure labeled Emily. "I'm sure." His breath hitched just slightly, his eyes searching hers for any trace of doubt. He didn't find it. His lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "Yeah, me too," he said softly. The house hummed with quiet energy again. The sound of feet on hardwood. Laughter. Life. Home. The house was alive with quiet warmth. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon floated through the air from the batch of cookies cooling on the kitchen counter. The soft buzz of the TV hummed in the background, playing an old animated movie that Jacob had already seen a dozen times but still watched like it was brand new. Ethan sat on the couch, his legs stretched out on the ottoman, a blanket draped lazily over his lap. His head rested against the back of the couch, his eyes half closed but still watchful. His gaze flicked to Jacob every so often, watching as his son sat cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully lining up his action figures in some kind of epic superhero battle. His little hands moved the figures around, making soft pow and whoosh sound effects under his breath. Emily was at the dining table, fingers busy as she flipped through a small stack of mail. Bills. Coupons. Flyers she didn't remember signing up for. She glanced at each one with little interest, her eyes occasionally darting toward the two boys in the living room. Her boys. Her chest warmed at the thought. She glanced down at her hand, running her thumb over her bare ring finger. Her eyes shifted to the kitchen counter. The velvet box still sat there, untouched but not ignored. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't forgotten. It was waiting. Just like she'd been waiting for the right moment. She stared at it for a moment, her fingers still holding the edge of the mail, her heart beating steady but firm. Her gaze flicked toward Ethan. He wasn't looking at her, but something about him, the way his body rested against the cushions, the quiet way he existed in their space, made something shift in her chest. It's time, she thought. Her hands moved before her mind could argue. She dropped the mail onto the table, walked over to the counter, and picked up the velvet box. Her fingers wrapped around it like it had always belonged to her. Her breath came out slow, steady, and she glanced once more at Ethan and Jacob. Jacob was still lost in his superhero world. Ethan was leaning forward slightly, stretching out his back like he was working out a kink in his ribs. He let out a low groan and rubbed his side, wincing just a little. "You good, old man?" she called from the kitchen, her tone light and teasing. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, his grin slow and lopsided. "Old man? Really?" he said, one eyebrow raised. "If the shoe fits," she shot back, walking toward him with the box still in her hand. Her voice was playful, but her heart wasn't. Her heart was beating faster with every step. Ethan sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he watched her approach. "What's that look for?" he asked, tilting his head, eyes flicking to her hands like he already knew something was up. Emily didn't answer right away. She stepped in front of him, standing directly between him and the TV. Jacob's little voice in the background continued his superhero commentary, completely oblivious to what was happening just a few feet away. Her eyes met Ethan's. Steady. Clear. Sure. She crouched down slowly, one knee on the carpet, her eyes never leaving his. "Emily," Ethan said softly, his voice low but sharp with realization. Her lips quirked into a small, sly smile. "Thought I'd save you the trouble, Williams," she said, lifting the velvet box in front of him, her fingers holding it with calm precision. Ethan blinked, his eyes flicking between the box and her face like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. His jaw tensed, his lips parting just slightly as he breathed in slow, measured breaths. "You serious right now?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief, his eyes so focused on her it felt like she was the only thing in the world. She smiled wider, popping the lid open with her thumb. The ring, small and simple but perfect, gleamed softly in the light. "I've never been more serious," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Her eyes locked on his, and she didn't look away. "Not this time. Not now." "Ethan Williams," she said, her voice steady but soft, every word coming straight from her heart. "You told me you knew where you stood. Well, I know where I stand too. Right here. With you. With Jacob. With us." His eyes glossed over, a sharp breath escaping him like he'd just been hit square in the chest. He blinked rapidly, his gaze darting between her face and the ring like he was trying to ground himself in reality. She tilted her head, her grin turning mischievous. "So, what do you say, big guy?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "You in?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed his hand to his face, rubbing at his eyes with his thumb and forefinger like he was trying to push back the tears threatening to fall. His other hand reached forward, slowly, carefully, like he was afraid touching her would make her disappear. But she didn't. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly along her jawline. His eyes met hers, and his breath came out like a quiet laugh, shaky but sure. "I'm so in," he said, his voice cracking just slightly at the end. "I'm all the way in, Emily." Her chest swelled with warmth so big it felt like it might spill out of her. Her face broke into the widest grin she'd ever worn, and she laughed, a soft, breathy, happy laugh. She pulled the ring from the box with 2 fingers and held his hand steady. Her fingers moved slowly, carefully, slipping the ring onto his finger. It fit perfectly. His eyes stayed on her the whole time. "Looks good on you," she said, tilting her head. "Looks better with you," he replied, his eyes soft but so sure. Click. Both of their heads turned at the same time to see Jacob holding up a toy camera, grinning from ear to ear. "Got it," Jacob declared, lowering the camera like he'd just captured the most important shot of his life. Emily tilted her head back and laughed so hard she had to cover her mouth. "You little sneak," she said, pointing at him, her eyes still watery from the moment she just shared with Ethan. "What? You guys were taking too long," Jacob said, dropping his camera and running toward them. He launched himself into Ethan's lap, arms wrapping tightly around him. Ethan let out a small grunt from the sudden pressure on his ribs but didn't complain. His arms came around Jacob, holding him close. "Did you say yes, Dad?" Jacob asked, looking up at him with wide, excited eyes. Ethan glanced at Emily, his grin lopsided and full of love. "Yeah, buddy," Ethan said, his eyes still on her. "I said yes." Jacob gasped dramatically, his eyes going wide like it was the best news in the world. "Does that mean Emily's my real mom now?" he asked, his voice full of pure, unfiltered hope. Emily's throat tightened, her eyes burning with emotion she wasn't ready for. She crouched down, her face level with his. "I've always been your Emily, champ," she said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "But if you're okay with it, I'd love to be your mom too." Jacob's face crumpled for half a second before he threw his arms around her neck, holding on so tight it felt like he was trying to fuse himself to her. His little body shook with quiet sniffles, his face pressed into her shoulder. "I'm okay with it," he mumbled, his voice muffled but sure. "I'm really, really okay with it." Emily's eyes squeezed shut, tears spilling over as she held him just as tightly. Ethan watched them, his hand pressed to his face again, his eyes red but his smile never fading. "This is it," Emily thought, breathing in the warmth of her son, and the steady gaze of the man she loved. No more waiting. No more running. No more wondering if she belonged. She belonged here. With them. With her family.